Imagine the sheer suffocating terror of standing on a desolate shoreline, watching the sails of your only way home slowly fade into the endless horizon. You are entirely alone on a jagged, uninhabited rock in the middle of the unforgiving Pacific Ocean, completely abandoned by your own crew. The silence that surrounds you isn't peaceful. It is deafening, heavy, and practically crawling with the promise of madness. Welcome back to VerityVault, where we uncover the untold and unlock the darkest corners of human history. Today we are opening a file that will make you question everything you thought you knew. Most of us know the sterilized, romanticized tale of Robinson Crusoe, a resilient castaway who turns an island into his personal kingdom, a story of triumph over nature that has been read to children for centuries. But the true story, the raw, blood-soaked history of the real man who inspired that legend, is far darker. It is a terrifying psychological study of isolation, betrayal, and the unraveling of the human mind. His name was Alexander Selkirk, and his island was not a tropical paradise. It was a green hell. To understand how a man ends up discarded at the edge of the world, we must first understand the chaos that forged him. Born in 1676 in the small coastal village of Lower Largo in Fife, Scotland, Alexander was the seventh son of a humble shoemaker. At this time, Scotland was a powder keg of political and religious unrest, entirely independent from England and constantly brimming with revolutionary tension. Raised in the shadow of the Glorious Revolution, Alexander absorbed the violence of his era. He was not a quiet, obedient boy destined to stitch leather in his father's workshop. He was fiercely rebellious, hot-tempered, and relentlessly drawn to conflict. By his early 20s, his aggressive behavior reached a boiling point. Following a violent and disgraceful outburst inside his local church, Alexander was summoned before the strict religious courts. Facing public condemnation and severe punishment, he made a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of his life. He fled the village, running toward the only place where brutality and insubordination were rewarded, the open ocean. Alexander became a privateer. If you strip away the fancy naval terminology, a privateer was simply a pirate with a government permission slip. During the War of the Spanish Succession, the British Crown essentially handed out licenses to hardened sailors, authorizing them to hunt, board, and butcher the crews of enemy French and Spanish merchant ships. It was a brutal, blood-soaked profession, but for a violent young man looking to escape his past and make a fortune, it was the perfect hiding place. For nearly a decade, Alexander thrived in this lawless environment, raiding ships across the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. By 1703, at the age of 27, he had built a reputation as a highly capable, if unpredictable, navigator. He joined an ambitious privateering expedition led by the legendary explorer Captain William Dampier. Dampier was a titan of the seas, a man who had mapped the coastlines of New Guinea and Australia. But Alexander was not assigned to Dampier's flagship. Instead, he was placed as the sailing master aboard the companion vessel, the Cinque. The Cinque was commanded by Thomas Stradling, a remarkably young, dangerously arrogant, and widely despised captain. From the moment they set sail, the atmosphere aboard the ship was toxic. The air below decks was thick with resentment, disease, and the constant threat of mutiny. To make matters worse, Stradling was an incompetent leader, punishing his crew with a sadistic level of discipline while completely ignoring the rapidly deteriorating condition of his own ship. Following a disastrous and failed raid on a Spanish settlement in Panama, the Cinque was falling apart. The wooden hull was rotting from the inside out, the sails were shredded, and the hull was leaking seawater at an alarming rate. Desperate for repairs, Captain Stradling anchored the dying vessel off the coast of an uninhabited archipelago in the South Pacific, known as the Juan Fernandez Islands. For weeks, the exhausted crew rested on the beach while attempting to patch the rotting wood. But before the vital caulking process was even finished, Stradling arrogantly ordered the men back aboard. He wanted to set sail immediately. Alexander Selkirk, possessing an expert knowledge of the sea, knew this was a suicidal command. The ship was not seaworthy. If they sailed into the deep ocean with an unsealed hull, the Cinque would become a wooden coffin for every man aboard. A vicious argument erupted on the beach. Alexander, fueled by his trademark rage, drew a line in the sand. He screamed at his captain, declaring that he would rather be marooned on this desolate, forgotten rock than step foot back on a doomed ship. He demanded his sea chest be brought ashore. It was a colossal gamble. Alexander fully expected the rest of the crew to side with him, to mutiny against Stradling, or at the very least, he expected the captain to back down. But Captain Stradling called his bluff. With a cold, vindictive smile, Stradling ordered Alexander's wooden chest to be tossed onto the sand. The crew, too terrified of the captain's wrath to intervene, silently boarded the rotting ship. As the Cinque ports raised its sails and slowly drifted away from the island, the terrifying reality of the situation crashed down upon Alexander. He waded into the freezing surf, screaming at the ship, begging to be taken back. But Stradling ignored him. The ship vanished over the horizon, leaving Alexander Selkirk utterly completely alone. He took inventory of his life. He had a musket, a meager supply of gunpowder and lead bullets, some tobacco, a hatchet, a knife, a kettle, navigation tools, and a Bible. That was all that stood between him and a horrific, lingering death. The first few months on the island were a psychological nightmare. Alexander was paralyzed by an overwhelming, crushing despair. The total absence of human voices creates a vacuum in the mind, and that vacuum is quickly filled with paranoia. He spent his days sitting motionless on the beach, scanning the empty horizon for a sail that never came. He barely ate. He considered using his musket to end his own life, a dark thought that constantly whispered in the back of his mind. But the nights were infinitely worse. The island was infested with thousands of massive, aggressive black rats, left behind by previous visiting ships. As soon as the sun set, the rats would emerge from the rocks. While Alexander tried to sleep in his crude makeshift shelter, the rats would swarm over his body, biting at his clothing, his feet, and his face. He was being eaten alive in the dark. Driven by pure survival instinct, Alexander was forced to adapt. To combat the horrifying rat infestation, he turned his attention to another invasive species on the island, feral cats. Using pieces of goat meat, he slowly gained the trust of the wild felines. Eventually, he managed to tame hundreds of them, creating a bizarre purring army that slept in his shelter, guarding him from the rats while he rested. As his gunpowder ran out, his musket became useless. He had to learn to hunt the island's feral goats on foot, chasing them barefoot across the jagged volcanic cliffs. When his European clothes rotted off his body in the humid tropical air, he didn't surrender to the elements. Using a rusted nail he forged into a needle, he taught himself how to stitch goat skins together, creating a thick primal armor. To keep his mind from entirely shattering into a million pieces, he turned to the only voice left to him, the Bible. The violent, rebellious brawler from Scotland began to read the scriptures aloud every single day. He sang psalms into the howling wind just to hear the sound of a human voice. Yet despite his efforts, the isolation slowly stripped away his humanity. He began to forget the English language. His words devolved into guttural grunts. He was no longer Alexander Selkirk, the sailing master. He had become an apex predator, a creature of the island. But he was not always alone. Over the agonizing span of 4 years, ships did occasionally drop anchor in the bay. But to Alexander's horror, they were not English vessels. They were Spanish warships. As a British privateer, if he were caught by the Spanish, he would be tortured and executed without a trial. On one terrifying occasion, a Spanish landing party spotted him on the beach. They didn't see a castaway in need of rescue. They saw a wild, demonic-looking man clad in animal skins. They immediately raised their muskets and opened fire. Bullets shattered the rocks around him as Alexander sprinted into the dense jungle. He scrambled up a massive tree, hiding perfectly still in the thick canopy. For hours he held his breath, listening to the Spanish sailors walking directly beneath his dangling feet, oblivious to the man hiding just inches above their heads. He survived, but the psychological toll of being hunted like an animal scarred him deeply. Finally, after 4 years and 4 months of total agonizing isolation on the 1st of February, 1709, 2 British privateering ships arrived at the island. They were led by Captain Woodes Rogers. When the rescue party rowed ashore, they were completely stunned. Standing on the beach was a wild, heavily bearded man, dressed head to toe in goat skins, holding a rusted musket. When they spoke to him, he could barely form a coherent sentence. He stammered, his tongue forgetting the shape of words, looking at the men not as saviors but as aliens. By an absolute stroke of fate, the pilot of the rescue ship was none other than William Dampier, the legendary captain from Alexander's previous voyage. Dampier instantly recognized the wild man and vouched for his incredible skills as a navigator. But as Alexander sat by the fire with his rescuers, struggling to relearn how to speak, Dampier delivered a piece of news that chilled Alexander to the bone. The Cinque Ports, the rotting ship that Captain Stradling had forced out to sea 4 years ago. Alexander had been absolutely right. Shortly after leaving the island, the ship had violently sunk off the coast of South America. Almost the entire crew drowned in the dark waters. Captain Stradling and a handful of survivors washed ashore, only to be captured by the Spanish and thrown into a brutal, lightless prison in Lima. By demanding to be abandoned on a deserted rock, Alexander Selkirk had unwittingly saved his own life. Alexander was brought aboard the rescue ship, appointed as the second mate, and spent the next few years plundering Spanish galleons. In 1711, he finally returned to England, walking off the docks with an astonishing £800 in prize money, a fortune roughly equivalent to $200,000 today. The wild man of the island had returned as a wealthy gentleman. But the human mind is a fragile thing, and trauma does not simply wash away with money. Alexander tried to integrate back into civilization. He bought nice clothes, drank in taverns, and walked the busy streets of London. But the noise of society was deafening to him. The claustrophobia of a populated city felt infinitely worse than the isolation of his island. He missed the pure, silent simplicity of his green hell. He missed the cats, the goats, and the absolute control he had over his secluded kingdom. He would spend hours sitting in his backyard, staring blankly at the sky, weeping for the prison he had fought so hard to escape. Unable to bear the overwhelming chaos of human society, the man who had survived over 4 years of absolute solitude could only last 6 years on land. In 1717, he fled back to the only place that made sense to him. He joined the Royal Navy, seeking the chaotic comfort of the ocean. He would never see land again. In 1721, somewhere off the coast of West Africa, Alexander Selkirk contracted yellow fever. Delirious and burning with sickness, his final words supposedly expressed a desperate, haunting desire to return to his desolate, rat-infested island. He died at sea, and his body was thrown into the dark abyss of the ocean. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but here at VerityVault we always find the key. What do you think really happened in this case? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to dive deeper into the unknown with us, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Until next time, stay vigilant.